We are going to talk about OpenID Connect in this video. OpenID Connect builds on top of OAuth. So if you don't know how OAuth works, watch my previous video and come back to this. OAuth is for authorization and OpenID Connect is for authentication. This is the protocol that you normally use whenever you want to log in using some third-party application. For example, when you are using social authentication like Google authentication or Facebook authentication in some application, this is the protocol that is used underneath. First, let's look at the problem that caused this protocol to be created, and then we'll come back to this protocol and understand this in detail. When OAuth was introduced for authorization, people immediately thought they could use it for authentication as well. But it is not what it is meant for, and we are not supposed to use it for authentication. But people still started using it. And when they started using it for authentication, this is how the flow looked like. Imagine you have an app and you want to use Google authentication for that app rather than implementing your own authentication. As a very first step, this app will go and register with Google as a valid app. When it does register, it will get client ID and client secret. The application stores that client ID and client secret for future use. Then, whenever user visits this application, it will redirect them to Google's authorization server. And Google's authorization server will prompt them to key in their Google username and password. Upon successful completion of this authentication, it will issue something called authorization token to this application. With this authorization code, client ID and client secret, the app will request access token from the authorization server. And with this access token, the application will try to access some API in the resource server. As long as it gets 200 response, as in it is able to access that API, the application will assume that this particular user is a valid user in Google, and simply because this particular user is a valid user in Google, it will consider that particular user as an authenticated user, and it will issue a session token for this application's authenticated session. So this is how OAuth was incorrectly used for authentication. Okay, this is working, right? We are able to authenticate user using OAuth protocol. What is the problem in it? Well, there are few problems in it. I'm going to highlight some of them now. First of all, the access token issued by authorization server is an opaque token, which means the client app should not parse it. Even if it can parse it, it should not parse it. And there is no standard for this token. It could be of any format. So if the authorization server or the provider suddenly changes the format, then the app or client will be at trouble. They can't parse it anymore. Secondly, because the token is an opaque token, the app cannot verify whether this token was issued for this application, and also it is issued for the user it thinks it is issued for. And thirdly, in order to validate whether the token is a valid token, it needs to make a call to one of the APIs in the resource server, and this will change from provider to provider. For example, Google will have some set of APIs and the app needs to pick one of them to call, and Facebook might have another set of API and the app has to pick one of them to call to make sure the token is a valid token. And if this API surface changes, then the app needs to change as well. These are some of the issues caused by using OAuth for authentication rather than just for authorization. So this is the reason OpenID Connect came into existence. People saw this and they thought, okay, this is not a standard way to do authentication. We need to do something about it. So they came up with this new protocol called OpenID Connect. Now let's look at in detail how this protocol works. Like I said earlier, this is built on top of OAuth. So most of the things that we have for OAuth will remain the same. The only additional thing that we'll have now is something called ID token. Now, the authorization server will issue ID token in addition to access token. When the application is requesting token from authorization server, it can either request ID token or access token or both. The ID token is meant to be consumed by this application. It is not for the resource server, and this ID token is always JWT token, which means this token can be parsed and the information in this token can be used by this application, and this format is not going to change because this is actually standardized and this is always JWT token. If you don't know how JWT token works, watch my previous video. So let's look at how this flow works with ID token. Now, as usual, the application goes and registers with the provider, in this case Google. This is one-time registration, and after completing that registration, the application will get something called client ID and client secret. The application will store them for future use. Then when user comes to this application, they'll be redirected to Google's authorization server for authentication, not the authorization, for authentication. Google's authorization server will present login page for that user, and the user will key in their Google username and password. On successful completion, they'll get something called authorization code. Now the application will use that authorization code along with client ID and client secret and go to the token endpoint of authorization server, and this time it can ask for something called ID token. ID token, like I said previously, it is a JWT token and it is meant to be consumed by the application. So this ID token will have things like application for which this token is meant for, which is basically the audience, and also the subject, which is who this token is issued for, who's the user for this token. And it will have some other information like claims that are facts about the user and the token itself. Now the application can parse that information. For example, if it needs to know the username or some other information about the user, then it can parse this ID token and use this token's information for its internal use. Even it can display that information on the UI. You can present this ID token to get access token as well. Remember, previously I said you can ask for ID token or access token or both, but if you just got ID token, you can present this ID token to authorization server and you can get the access token. Like previously, the resource server cannot use ID token. It only works with access token. So if you want to make some API call after successful authentication with Google using this OpenID Connect, you still need to get the access token. And to get the access token, you can either present authorization code, client ID and client secret, or if you have already obtained ID token, you can simply present that ID token to authorization server to get a new access token. And with that access token, you'll be able to access your resource server. Okay, so this is how OpenID Connect works at a very, very high level. Hope this is useful. Thank you.